First, we're going to have Lanhee Chen, who is the David and Diane Steffi Fellow in American Public Policy Studies here at Hoover. He has a PhD in political science and law, and a law degree from Harvard University, and is a veteran of several high-profile American political campaigns, including for presidential efforts. He's been a lecturer at Stanford Law School, and he's been a visiting professor of public policy at Pepperdine University. He's a frequent commentator in U.S. national media and an author on numerous papers on subjects as diverse as healthcare reform and the U.S. Electoral College. He's a frequent visitor to Taiwan and a keen observer of its democratic evolution, and we look forward to his remarks on it today. Following Lanhee will be Eric Yu. Eric is a familiar face to many here at Stanford and at Hoover. As Larry said, he was the inaugural program manager for the program on democracy in Taiwan from 2006 to 2009. He has a PhD in political science from Columbia University and is now a research fellow in program. He's now an associate professor at National Zhengzhou University in Taiwan, where he studies and is an associate research fellow in their Election Studies Center. He's published widely on Taiwan elections in both English and Chinese, studies of partisanship and public opinion in a volume edited by Larry on the Chen Shui-bian years, and he's done studies on campaign advertising and candidate selection. So without further delay, let me bring up Lanhee to begin our proceedings. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Larry, for putting this program together and this opportunity. Some of you probably wondering, what's a guy who primarily studies American politics and American campaigns and elections doing talking about Taiwan? But I had the opportunity and honor to observe the elections that took place in early January on the ground in Taipei, and was really so struck by that experience, so struck by what I saw, that I really think there are a number of interesting lessons and opportunities for American democracy as we sit at this very arguably precarious time in our own development as a democracy here in the United States. I wanted to share some of the observations from Taiwan and how they inform my own understanding of what's happening here in the United States. What I think some of the values were that were portrayed by the election and the campaign around it. And just as an observer, somebody, I've been involved in several U.S. presidential campaigns, including as Mitt Romney's chief policy advisor in 2012. And so it's just striking to me to observe and to view the closing days of a presidential campaign in a completely different country and see so many similarities to how we conduct campaigns and elections here in the U.S. And in fact, I'm going to show some video that I took when I was on the ground in Taipei, because I think it echoes a lot of the same themes and a lot of the same experiences that I've had here in the U.S. And it was just striking. I wasn't expecting to see that. So to a certain degree, I wanted to reflect that. So when I tell colleagues who don't do a lot of work on Taiwan that I'm going there, and I mentioned sort of these observations of Taiwanese democracy, this is the kind of thing that people tend to respond with, and it's something of a character. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's interesting. There's a lot of great video online. If you want to go to YouTube, you can entertain yourself for hours like I did while putting together this presentation, watching the video. But the reality is that the democratic process in Taiwan is quite well developed. I think in a lot of ways, what I observed was a very, in some ways, organized presidential campaign, two very organized presidential campaigns, who were elucidating themes and elucidating ideas that would be very familiar to American observers. These are just some pictures I took of the campaign headquarters of Tsai Ing-wen, the incumbent president, who ended up winning election in quite grand style. The next shot down is a shot of the crowd at the last rally for the Kuomintang candidate, Han Kuo-yu. And then this is a shot of the election information and counting center, where we were taken after the election had concluded. And all of the election results come into a centralized facility where they're made available to the media and to interested observers. It was a really interesting place to be able to gather to watch the election results come in. Interestingly enough, we'll get to this a little bit later, but the election results coming into the official center actually lagged what most news media were reporting. So the news media actually had more accurate and timely information than the official government sources, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then finally, I caught a woman, unbeknownst to her, taking a picture of her. I'm not sure if that's legal in Taiwan, probably not. But anyway, I took a picture of her while exiting the balloting center that we were able to visit during our trip. So, as I said, I think in a lot of ways the caricature of what Taiwanese democracy is like is not very much like what I saw. In a lot of ways, what I saw is very much what you might expect to see here in the United States during a major election. Let me start by providing some observations, and then we'll come back around at the end to what I think are some key values that I believe are elucidated by the Taiwanese process. First of all, there's remarkably high public awareness of the campaign. I speak Taiwanese dialect. I was raised speaking it, so I am able to communicate with cab drivers quite easily, as it turns out. So I took some time and I rode around the city a little bit, and I talked to cab drivers who are always a source of very good conversation in Taipei. And I talked to just ordinary people I would see, and they would clearly see this guy doesn't look like he's from here. So, they would want to know about the United States, and I'd want to know about Taiwan. What was remarkable was how much people on the street knew about the platforms and about the policy proposals of the various candidates, of not just the two presidential candidates, but the parties they represented. And what was interesting was that level of information extended beyond the rather high salience presidential campaign to the relatively what you might think of as lower salience legislative elections as well. People were familiar with the backgrounds of their candidates for the legislature, not just their local candidates, but also some of the at-large candidates for legislative UN as well. And so I was quite impressed by that. I was also impressed by the observations of people in the general public of the need for an orderly transition of power regardless of the winner. And this was the case whether one supported the nationalist candidate or one supported the DPP candidate. People felt that this orderly transition was a very important element of the campaign and of the electoral process. Much like the United States, you can turn on your television to one channel and hear one story, and a different channel and hear a totally different story, almost as if you were in a completely different universe. And so I had the opportunity to watch a little television when I was there and noticed that the media environment, as the electoral environment was quite polarized. And I think that in some ways, what we observe in the United States, at least my argument would be that a lot of the political polarization we're witnessing has really been reinforced by the presence of a polarized news media here in the US, the presence of polarization on social media. I saw that very much identically in Taiwan. If you were supporting a nationalist candidate, you knew what channel you had to turn on to get your daily fix. And if you supported the DPP candidate, you know what channel to turn on to feel comfortable about things. And that polarization was very much present in the media environment as well. The other thing that I thought was interesting was there was a lot of news media coverage in the weeks leading up to the election, particularly in Western media sources, about the efforts of the PRC in particular to sow disinformation campaigns in Taiwan that in an effort to influence the election. The readback that I got from a lot of the Taiwanese officials we met with in the days before the election was that problem had actually subsided to some degree in let's say, the week before the election, but in the month to 2 months before was actually a quite significant problem. But the aggressiveness and the candor with which the government addressed those issues, I thought was very interesting, particularly given how sensitive disinformation has been as a topic here in the US, and how much disagreement there's been over the extent, or disagreement among some at least, with respect to the extent and the nature of disinformation campaigns being launched by foreign nationals or foreign entities here in the US. There was a coalescence, a whole of government effort in Taiwan to address that, and I did think that was quite interesting to note as well. I also thought it was interesting the degree to which the local population, a lot of people whom I spoke to, and again, you have to take this with a grain of salt because the sample wasn't entirely representative, perhaps. But the people who I talked to, a lot of them seem to frame the election as a referendum between drawing closer to the PRC versus drawing closer to the West. And I hadn't thought of it that way. I didn't really know how to think of it going into it, but I suppose that makes sense, given that I think this has been a tension at the center of Taiwanese politics for some time, and indeed a tension at the center of society. And so to see a major and consequential election in that way and through that frame, I think makes entire sense to me now that I'm back. But when I was there, I was struck by the degree to which people were commenting on how the election was, in their minds, this sort of very clear referendum between drawing closer to one side or another. And then the last thing I'll just say is, Taiwan's democracy is relatively young, but to me at least, and there are others in this room who have observed much more and have seen much more, and are certainly much more expert than I am on this. There were elements of it that appeared certainly relatively mature to me. And as I said, I think the constant reminders of the United States, I was there, the group that I was with was composed of primarily scholars who study elections in some form or another, many of whom study elections here in the US, and the thing we kept on saying to each other was, this is just like we would see in the US, this is just like we would see in the closing days of a presidential campaign, this is just as we would see there. And so there's a certain maturity that I think is probably undersold to audiences who don't spend as much time thinking about or looking at Taiwan. So let me start by talking a little bit about the campaign, and specifically because we did get to view the last few days of the campaign. And we went to both rallies, so each of the parties and candidates had final rallies, kind of as you might have here in the US, a big campaign rally before the election. And what was interesting is both parties used the same site for the rally. So it's a very beautiful public square, very close to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs office, which is itself a beautiful Japanese-era building. So they use the same site for first the KMT rally, and then the next day they change all the signs and it becomes a DPP rally, which is kind of cool, I thought. Walking around at 7 in the morning, seeing people pulling the signs down and putting the other signs up. But it's a remarkable amount of energy. There were, you may be familiar that here in the U.S. there have been some disputes over crowd size occasionally, the leadership of our country. But there were the KMT folks claimed they had 1 million people at their closing rally. The DPP folks, I think, made similar claims. Both crowds look really big to me, so I'm not a good person at counting crowds, but it was remarkable, really. The number of people, the level of energy, the festiveness around it. I was struck by the degree to which campaign surrogates can play an important role in these closing rallies. And so the structure of these rallies would be you have all sorts of local leaders, legislative leaders coming up to extol the virtues of the top of the ticket, which is what you might see here in the U.S. as well. And those surrogates kind of take on a life of their own. In particular, I recall that at the KMT rally had promised a special guest at the end. And I don't know, Eric, I don't know if this was a special guest or not, but out comes a 40-something-year-old female legislator in a Wonder Woman outfit. and I literally, she was in a Wonder Woman outfit. And it was remarkable. It was cool. It was kind of interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen that in the U.S. But she was a surrogate for the campaign of Han Kuo-yi and was very good at firing the crowd up. And so that was interesting. There was all sorts of disputes regarding the accuracy of polling. And having worked on several presidential campaigns, I'm familiar with the art of trying to dispute a bad poll for your candidate. And I can tell you how much spin I got from both sides about the nature of the polling. The KMT folks had told me, well, the polls aren't reliable, you see, because 3 weeks ago, Han Kuo-yi said to all of his supporters, lie when someone calls you and says who you're going to vote for. Say that you're going to vote for the incumbent instead of saying you're going to vote for me, and that way no one will be able to trust any of the polls. So they all said, they all said in the days leading up to the election, well, it's going to be a lot closer than you think. our internal polling actually has him winning, and I said, well, that's remarkable since the public polling has you down 30, so that's pretty But I appreciated hearing that, and obviously the DPP side said, we believe we're going to win, we don't believe it's going to be close, but it was just interesting hearing from the insiders on both sides, their take and their perspective on polling. This notion of foreign influence was a big part of the campaign narrative, wanting to keep foreign influence out, each side trying to paint the other as being somehow more influenced by foreign sources and somehow that being a bad thing. That was a significant theme I heard over and over all in the closing day. And then so much television advertising. It's probably a lot like what our friends in Iowa are seeing now with the Iowa caucuses coming on Monday night. In much the same way you could not turn on the television without literally every other ad, in some cases every ad being for a political candidate. And not just for the two major candidates. You also had Song Tzu-yi's party, one of these third parties, also being quite active on television, which I thought was really interesting. But the degree to which that campaign advertising was present was really quite remarkable. So I did want to share with you a comparison between the scene from a closing campaign rally in 2012 that I was with Mitt Romney about a week before the election. And then I want to show you a clip that I took at the KMT rally, and I want you to see kind of why it might be that I would have observed that the two societies bear a lot of similarities. So let's see if we can roll this. Oh, sorry. Go back. Sorry. Can you guys do the Fairfax, Virginia one first? Aside from being much more musical, I mean, it was really striking, and then the DPP rally had a very similar sort of flair the next night, so I thought that was kind of interesting. The other thing that I thought was interesting was the degree to which, if you think about how you run a campaign in the United States as an incumbent versus a non-incumbent, a lot of the campaign strategies and themes were also very similar. So if you think about a non-incumbent running against an incumbent, they're oftentimes going to talk about how the last few years have been a disaster in some way. I mean, it's an age-old thing, right? Sort of saying, everything's bad. Don't you guys feel like things are really going horribly? It's the same kind of thematic that you saw the KMT candidate applying in his campaign. Literally every single campaign speech was about how the last 4 years have not been good, how the next 4 years can be better, and very much sort of in that retrospective way, trying to say, look, here's the reason why you need to change candidates, right? The case for change, in essence. I also thought it was interesting, there was a lot of, and Eric may touch on this a little bit, there was a lot of anti-establishment, anti-intellectual rhetoric that you saw from the KMT candidate. And not just that, that was coupled with rhetoric about a restoration of things from the past. And it did remind me a lot of the Trump campaign from 2016. A lot of very similar themes of anti-establishmentism, a desire to restore a past that people, undoubtedly some people who voted for that candidate missed. And I think you saw some of that in a very similar way. The challenger, Mayor Han, spoke a lot about how he felt sad that the flag of the Republic of China seemed to be disappearing, or that the use of the nomenclature of the Republic of China was disappearing. And that seemed to be a big part of his campaign. So this desire to restore the past, he also in a debate made a comment that essentially we've got to stop electing law professors from National Taiwan University as the leaders of our country. Right? We sort of said this and said, we need something different. Very similar to the kind of appeal that we've heard, and it just underscores the degree to which the populism and the anti-establishmentism we've seen in the US really extend far beyond the borders of this country to other democracies as well. And obviously for the incumbent, I think she took a much more conservative campaign strategy, emphasizing the accomplishments of her administration. There was an element of her dialogue that suggested voting for Mayor Han would be risky, that it would be a risky thing to do, someone who was unproven, who hadn't spent much time in government, who didn't understand things. Again, very much similar to the kind of themes you might hear echoed by Hillary Clinton in 2016 against Donald Trump. Even though she wasn't the incumbent, in some ways she took on the mantle of being the incumbent a little bit in 2016. And then, the degree to which the Tsai campaign tried to engage younger voters was really impressive. We visited a number of campaign headquarters for the DPP candidates that were focused really on mobilizing youth voters and focusing on getting the message out to youth voters, and I thought that was intriguing. Here in the U.S., there's a sense that youth voters don't really show up anyway, so why bother? But I think more and more we're starting to see some of that in the Democratic Party here in efforts to turn out the youth vote as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the actual voting, since I thought that was interesting. I think it reflects, again, some important themes that I want to come to at the end of this talk. The polls were open on a Saturday from 8 to 4. They were well secured. They were well staffed. Once the polling closed, so we were asked to stay outside because we were not permitted to vote in the elections. They didn't want us in the polling site, but we could see through the windows. Once the polling stopped, they actually have these ballot boxes that they seal with two pieces of paper. And then once all of that has been done, they let whoever wants to come into the polling station. So you can be a concerned citizen, you can be a foreign observer, and you have to stay behind a certain line, but you're able to see the actual unveiling of the ballots and the counting of the ballots individually. And so it's interesting what happens. The election monitor, the guy who I guess is running that polling location, comes up and says, this is the number of votes that were cast, this is the location of the polling location, and then proceeds to actually physically unseal the ballot boxes. I'm actually going to go to the next slide and not play this video because I wanted to show the vote counting. And this I also thought was interesting because here in the US, we always have these disputes about vote counts and recounts, and it seems to happen more and more as elections get contentious, particularly in certain parts of the country. There, all the vote counting is conducted right there in front of you. It's all transparent. Each individual ballot is shown and is recorded on a piece of butcher paper. I understand from a colleague of mine that they used to use chalkboards, but they don't do that anymore. They actually record them on there. And you can videotape, you can record, you can do whatever you want. It is incredibly transparent. So I'll show you an example of them counting the votes. As they open the boxes here, you will see they pull these ballots out and they go for it.
立委3号林玉芳一票，立委
总统3号蔡英文一票
3号蔡英文一票，
总统3号蔡英文一票
立委蔡英文一票，
总统2号韩国瑜一票
2号韩国瑜一票，
总统2号韩国瑜一票
2号韩国瑜一票，
总统2号韩国瑜一票
2号韩国瑜一票，
总统3号蔡英文一票
3号蔡英文一票。
So, the person on the left is counting presidential ballots, the person on the right is counting ballots for the legislative branch. And they literally go through every single ballot, and they make clear exactly who the ballot was for. It's accumulated on the piece of butcher paper, and it's there for everybody to see.
No hang the check.
And there's no, in fact, I didn't put it in the presentation. There actually is they put outside the polling station a poster that says, here are all the ways to make sure your vote doesn't get counted. And it's all the different kinds of markings, because you mark it with a pen, all the different kinds of markings that you might expect people would desire to make. Like what happens if you put your circle right in between the two lines? Or what happens if you draw a starfish on the bottom of the ballot? There's all sorts of scenarios that you would be flabbergasted by. But it details exactly, look, if you mark your ballot improperly, it will not be counted, just so we're letting you know. We don't, we have a much more difficult challenge with some of our balloting here in the U.S. So anyway, I thought this whole process, this was the most intriguing observation for me out of the whole thing. So, these are the key values that I observed as I reflect on the time that I spent there. A remarkable amount of transparency, which I think is interesting. To those of us who maybe here in the U.S. are used to a slightly less transparent process of how these ballots actually get counted. They go off to some central counting center. For example, here in Santa Clara County, our ballots go to a counting center somewhere in San Jose, and they're counted and a number is reported. But this was really sort of transparency to a new level. I do think there was an emphasis on fairness, and I'm just thinking about the campaign rally and using the exact same locations so that campaigns didn't have to go scout different locations and have problems sort of figuring out how to accommodate their supporters. Offering the same site to both candidates, I thought was kind of novel. A strong emphasis on election security. Every voter has to present not just a physical form of identification, but also their stamp, their chop, in order to vote, which I thought, again, speaks to some of the debates we have in this country over voter ID. A pretty efficient process, notwithstanding the fact that you've got to go through each individual ballot. The amount of time it took to count all the ballots and to report results from start to finish was actually pretty efficient. And then a significant amount of accountability. I think everybody involved, I talked to one of the people staffing the precinct, and they all felt very much accountable for conducting the election in a way that would be perceived as free and fair to the rest of the world. And I think that is something about a young democracy that is quite refreshing, is a desire to show the world that, hey, we're doing this in the right way, and lest you think there's some funny stuff going on, we're going to show you exactly what it is that's going on. I'll just close by noting a few issues that I think are challenging in the American context as we think about it. The first issue is, I do think in the U.S., election security is a challenge here in the U.S., not necessarily the physical location of the balloting, but the way in which we count, the way in which we secure the vote. The increasing desire to use digital voting and electronic voting, I think, does pose some questions about the best way for us to address issues of election security, which are very real. We have a debate here in the U.S. regarding voter identification. I don't think we need to get into that too much, but I'll just say that it was unquestioned in Taiwan that a voter showing up to vote had to present some kind of identification to demonstrate that they were eligible to vote. And I tend to think that there are lessons to be learned from that in terms of placing election, in addition to election security, sort of valuing that I think is something that we ought to think about seriously here as well. As I mentioned earlier, they're very clear about what counts and what doesn't count. And I think sometimes in the American context that has been an issue and continues to be an issue in some cases. They obviously, the Taiwanese obviously have centralization in how elections are administered. We don't. Right? One of the challenges we have is we have different registrars of voters in counties here in the U.S. We have different states handling things different ways. That creates a whole patchwork of regulatory and other concerns that you don't have if you have a centralized system, right? So one questions whether, in fact, there needs to be more centralization versus the dispersion we see. The answer might be America is a country of 300 some odd million people, and it's much more difficult to centralize, probably much easier to run elections the way we do, but it does raise some ancillary challenges when you do it the way that we do. And then the last thing I'll say is, I've begun to think that in some ways we need to be better about embracing the polarization that we see in America. Not to say that it's good or that we want it to continue, but to a certain degree, I think that there's an element of our politics now where we're always going to have some kind and measure and degree of polarization. We have since the founding in America. What I thought about Taiwan was, there wasn't a wringing of hands about polarization. There was a relative acceptance of the fact that people are going to feel differently and they're going to have different points of view, and that's going to reflect in media, that's going to reflect in how people think about each other and how people think about politics. And I think here in the US, we spend a lot of time worrying about polarization instead of saying, okay, we have it, how do we address some of the side effects of it, or how do we ensure that it doesn't overtake our system in a way that's truly detrimental to advancing our democracy, which I know that all good citizens here want to do. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some of these observations with you. I know it's a little bit unconventional. Eric will be the guy that will give you all the actual information about what happened. But appreciate the project, and thank you for having me today.
I'm Eric Yu, and it's always good to be here. And I enjoy coming back to Bay Area, so like every other year, to present something about elections. And before I start to talk about Taiwan's election, I want to echo several points about Lanhee's, particularly the final points about the electronic voting. I was commissioned by Taiwan Central Election Commissions several years ago to study and actually to design the electronic voting machine, because we want to introduce the digital voting system to help to overcome, for example, like absentee voting. But in fact, the general public are really satisfied with the current system. More than 76% of the general public are satisfied with the current system, including the voting and as well as the vote counting procedures. That's why it's extremely difficult to introduce like the electronic voting system, because once you have that kind of system, there is no official vote counting procedures. Then you just observe. So I think that's probably why we stick on the paper castle type of voting system. And so I actually made two, incorporated with some computer science people. We did design two prototype electronic voting machine system in Central Election Commissions. It's still there, so if you get a chance to go there, you can actually look at those two prototypes. Okay, so I think the one interesting part of this election is because of the 2018 local elections. Because over the past 4 years, for those people who are familiar with Taiwanese politics, we had Tsai Ing-wen elected in 2016, and then she actually faced a big defeat. DPP actually had a big defeat in 2018, in the sense that the KMT won more than 15 seats out of 23 local county and mayor elections. So that's put some kind of questions whether the DPP can win in the 2020 elections. That's why this election is kind of interesting. So I want to explain the swing of the electoral pendulums in Taiwan between 2016 and 2020. So these are some facts about the 2020 elections. We do have the combined elections, presidential elections, plus the legislative yuan elections, including 73 single-member districts, plus 6 seats for original voters in 2 single non-transferable voting system districts. And we also have 34 seats for the party list. So the eligible voters is about 19 million. So these are 3 candidates: DPP's Tsai Ing-wen, KMT's Han Kuo-yu, and People First Party's Chen Shou, who ran the presidential candidates 5 times. Okay. So really, we do have a lot of candidates this time for the parliamentary elections. 433 candidates registered in the LY elections, and we do have 19 parties put on the party list. So you see that there are, in fact, in Taiwan now it's about 300 parties. So this time we have a super long balance for the party list, because 19 parties list on the wants to join the election. One of the reasons why we attract a lot of parties, because of we do have a semi-public funding systems. Once you get the votes, more than 3% of the votes on the party for the party list, you will get the public funding for 50 NT dollars. It's about less than $2, less than $2 US. It's like 1.5 US dollars per vote. So if you exceed the 3% threshold, you can get the public funding for the next 4 years to run your parties. That's why the party really want to jump into the LY elections. Okay, so this here is we just simply do a quick comparison between 2016 elections and 2020 elections. So in these elections, in the 2016 elections, Taiwan got about 6.8 million votes and 56% of the vote share, and the turnout was the lowest, which is only 65%. Okay, and this time, I should highlight Tsai Ing-wen. The key issue is that you see the vote share is pretty similar, right? It's 57 vote shares, but of course the number of votes increased significantly simply because of the higher turnout. Okay, about the legislative yuan elections, last time the DPP had enjoyed a good 68, enjoy a great majority that has 68 seats out of 113. And this time, I'm sorry, this one should be 61. This time, DPP has 61 seats rather than 68. And the KMT now has 38 rather than 35. So, and here is the party vote. To show this one, I want to show the PR seats. So here is the DPP and KMT's PR vote shares. So pretty similar. Both parties gain like 34% of the vote shares for the party list ballots. So the bottom line I want to emphasize, I actually categorize this election as a kind of maintaining elections. Try to actually maintain the landscape of the 2016 elections. So it doesn't seem to be an interesting part, right? If we don't analyze the 2018 elections, but because in 2018 local elections, DPP was defeated by more than 1.2 million votes. In the 2018 local elections, the KMT gained more than 6.1 million votes, and the DPP only get 4.9 million votes. So why did the DPP can come back from the 2018 defeat of the local elections? So I want to explain the swing of the electoral pendulum. So three perspectives. One is from the party competition's perspective. So because Han Kuo-yu was actually he was not Lanhee mentioned that his rhetoric has full of anti-establishment. He used a lot of anti-establishment language, and he's not a typical KMT politician. And he actually, but 2018 was a big victory of Han Kuo-yu. And I think that kind of victory becomes the curse of the KMT in the 2020 elections. And I will talk about why it was the case. And then the second thing I want to talk about the issue clip is what is the most important issue in the 2020 elections. And then the third thing I want to talk about the final thing, when the voters go to the polling station to cast their votes, what I think is most important, particularly for the presidential elections, about trust. And I want to use some data to show that that's why Tsai Ing-wen still gain a lot of trust among the general public. So that's why he can win the presidential elections. So for those people who are know Taiwan's politics, it's always about identity issues. So 3 different measures about Taiwanese identities. One is we call it ethnic identities sometimes. Sometimes we call it ethnic identities. I think for those people who study Taiwanese politics, we always focus on the question of whether you are Taiwanese or Chinese or both. That's kind of the major identity issues in Taiwan. And the second thing is about when we have the identity, how do we label the party competitions on the identity spectrums? So we have Taiwanese versus Chinese identity. We have Taiwan independence versus unifications. We have KMT. We have the DPP on the independent side versus KMT pro-China side. So these are identity issues, and here are some measures my institution, the Election Study Center, have conducted surveys in early 90s up to now. So we release our data like every 6 months. So you can see the trend here. The green line is the Taiwanese identity measures. So now this is a data released from the last June. So about 57% of the people identify themselves Taiwanese, and about 36% of them have dual identity. Dual identity means they identify themselves both Chinese and Taiwanese, and only about a little bit more than 3% of the people identify them Chinese. So you see that over time, the Taiwanese identity increased significantly. The interesting part here is that starting from 2016, when Tsai Ing-wen got elected, you see that there is a small increase of the dual identity and a small decrease of the Taiwanese identity until when? Until the end of 2018. And last year, 2019, the Taiwanese identity start to increase a little bit. So some people think that it could be the Hong Kong's incident, the effect of Hong Kong's incident. We don't know, but you do see that the trend, the Taiwanese identity somehow decreased a little bit, and the dual identity increased a little bit over time, starting from 2014. 2014 was also an interesting year because that was the year for the Sunflower Movement. Okay, so that was the peak of the Taiwanese identity, and there are some debates about why the dual identity increased a little bit while the Taiwanese identity decreased, and we can talk about that in a Q&A session if you are interested about that, because there are 2 different theories talking about the change. But the bottom line is we do see Taiwanese identity slightly increase last year. Okay, this one is unification versus independence. The green line is a in Taiwan, the majorities always say that they want to maintain the status quo. So you see the black line is maintain the status quo and decide it later. And the blue line is maintain the status quo and forever, indefinitely. The green line is kind of maintain the status quo but move to independence in the future. The red line here is maintain the status quo but move to the unification in the future. You do see, again, this last year it was a slightly increase toward the independence side, right? So move to maintain the status quo, move to the independence, increase a little bit, and maintain the status quo indefinitely also increase a little bit. And this one is the major one I want to show you about the party strength. So the blue line is KMT support, the green line is DPP support. So starting from the 2016, it was the lowest point of the KMT support. It's pretty straightforward, right? Because the KMT lost the presidential elections for badly. But you see that over the past 4 years, it did not increase significantly, only like 7 to 8 percentage points of the KMT supports. And the DPP supports decreased significantly since 2016 because the people complained that the Taiwan didn't do well in particularly for the domestic policies, regarding domestic policies, but increased again in 2019. The point I want to make is that the decrease of the DPP does not necessarily translate to the increase of the KMT. So if you compare to the 2012 threshold, 2012 was the time that the Ma Ying-jeou got reelected. It's about more than 30% of the KMT supports. The KMT did not actually gain a lot of supports to make a big shift, to make a shift in terms of the base partisan supports. So a lot of voters, I think, would like to identify themselves as independent voters. So the next thing I want to show is this is the presidential approval ratings. We conduct the presidential approval rating every 3 months. So every quarter. It's a quarterly survey. So here is the line starting from for the Tsai Ing-wen, the right-hand side of the dashed line. So Tsai Ing-wen's approval rating decreased very quickly once she inaugurates 4 years ago. Decreased significantly and going down to the third quarter of the 2018, just right before the local election, it was the lowest point. But her approval rating bounced back very quickly, particularly in 2019. So there is nothing about the economic performance, because I also draw a line. This is the Taiwan's economic growth rate by GDP. So you see that here is the high points of Taiwan's economic growth in between 2017 and 2018. But even with the high level of economic growth, Tsai Ing-wen's approval rating is still low. So it's not necessarily, so when we talk about, even though we know that the economic perspective is really a kind of a key indicator associated with the approval rating, but not necessarily in Taiwan. So given that Taiwan's high economic growth between 2017 and 2018, Tsai Ing-wen's approval rating is still not good at all. Was not good at all. But her approval rating bounced back last year. So this was the map of after the 2018 election. You see a lot of blue area, right? So KMT won big in the 2018 elections, particularly Kaohsiung. It was a green area, but Hanguoyu, you see the big rally. It was a big rallies before the 2018 local elections. Hanguoyu was capable to gain some kind of momentum right before the 2018 elections, and then he won the Kaohsiung City Mayor elections. And here is the map of 2020 presidential election. You see everywhere is a green, and these areas tend to be dark green. That means DPP won big in the southern Taiwan. So you see only 2 years, there are kind of a big swing in terms of the votes. So first thing I want to talk about is about Han Kuo-yu's victory in Kaohsiung. Was the KMT's 2018 victory was actually a curse of the KMT, because KMT thought that it has the momentum to win 2020 election, but in fact it's not necessarily true. before the 2020, after the 2020 election, 2018 elections, we conduct a survey asking people whether 2018 election was a confident vote against Tsai Ing-wen or just a local election. Even though people say that, well, it can be regarded as a confidence vote against the DPP administration. But when I use the data to conduct the analysis, I do see that in Kaohsiung City Mayor election, it was not the national factor, but the local factor that determines Han Kuo-yu's victory. That means people in Kaohsiung simply want to have a change because DPP has been a local ruling party for over 20 years. So those residents, people in Kaohsiung, simply wants to have a new party to be in charge as the city mayor. And it's not necessarily reflect to the unsatisfaction of the national government. Okay, so even though people said it's a confidence vote against the Tsai Ing-wen administration for the local elections, but in fact, when you do the more sophisticated analysis, you do see that local factors is the determining factors, not the national factor. Okay, so given that it was not in the national scope, but what did Han Kuo-yu did? What Han Kuo-yu did actually create a momentum and some kind of spillover effect for the KMT to win the 2018 elections, that's for sure. And because of that victory, it rejuvenates KMT's local party factions. That's why in the 2020 elections, we do see a lot of local factions candidates participated in the legislative yuan elections. That actually cost KMT, particularly in the southern part of Taiwan. Those local factions candidates are not able to gain the median votes to win the elections, particularly in those single-member districts. So, because Han Kuo-yu seems to be a hero for the 2018 elections, then there was he is capable to get a lot of supporters we call Han's fans, and those people consist of three type of supporters. One is, I call it economic marginal voters. Those people who actually lost some economic benefits simply because of the decrease of the cross-strait exchange. Because under the Tsai Ing-wen administration, China doesn't want to send tourists to Taiwan, and the shrink of the cross-strait economic exchange actually hurts those small vendors, those small vendors or small business, those that relies on the cross-strait exchange. So those are economic marginal voters tend to support Han Kuo-yu. The second type of people are those people who suffer from the pension reform. Because one of the major accomplishments that Tsai Ing-wen has been doing is to reform the public servant pension reform. And for example, like my pension has been cut in half because I work for the National University, right? So I was kind of the person who suffered from pension reform. I didn't mean that I support but in general, a lot of those professors, teachers, and public servants, and even military people suffer from the pension reform. So they tend to support, some of them tend to support Han Kuo-yu. And also, the third part, I think Lanhee talked about some people miss the good old days, right? Republic of China, and miss the flags. Those are political marginal voters. That means some people miss the old days and they thought that their political perspective are not necessarily correct in a recent time in Taiwan, because we all focus on Taiwanese identities everything should be Taiwan first rather than ROC first. So those are political marginal voters who tend to support Hangul. So Hangul is able to have these marginal voters to put together. That's why whenever you go to Hangul's rally, you see those faces are those are heterogeneous groups. They doesn't seem to be a good fit together, but Hangul is capable to gain those supports. So Han's base is very cohesive and exclusive. These people, because they are marginal voters, so they thought that they are somehow disadvantaged, and they try to use Hangul as a symbol to speak out. And because Han's base is cohesive but exclusive, so one of the problem of Han's campaign is it's really difficult to outreach to the medium voters. And then there will be in the middle of the 2019, two parties have had party primaries. In Taiwan, it's interesting to use telephone pollings to conduct primaries. And who are going to take those telephone calls? So you need to mobilize your supporters to stay at home and pick up the phone, to answer the phone. Okay, so some of the stories say that the Hangul supporters, they tend to stay at home for a week to wait for the calls. Okay, so one who can mobilize his supporters to stay at home can win the primary. And so Hangul and Taiwan are able to mobilize their supporters. And then I just briefly talk about those people who do not support Hangul. What's the reason why for not supporting Hangul? 40% of the people think that Hangul did not realize his policy, did not finish his term. So that was kind of a very important issue for Hangul, because Han just being elected as a Kaohsiung city mayor, and then he ran for the president. So 40% of the people think that he should stay in Kaohsiung city mayor, should not run for the president. Plus, he did not realize his policy platforms for Kaohsiung. And about 35% do not like his personal negative image, like slip of the tongue. He sometimes say something interesting, okay, or offensive, particularly to women. And only 7% of the people who do, among those who do not like him, only 7% of the people think that he's pro-China. So it's not necessarily his policy stance, but actually his personal image. Okay. So, so the bottom line is that Han did not establish a trustworthy image as a presidential candidate. Okay. So let me just briefly go over some issue data. Some people, we always say that economic development is #1 issue in Taiwan for the presidential election. And again, in this election, it's still the same. 45% think economic development is the most important thing. But this time, there are 28% of the people say sovereignty protection is also important. And 27% of the people think that both of them are very important. So you see the increasing importance of the sovereignty protection. This is one wave of survey. And here is another wave of surveys. In these surveys, I asked 5 different policy issues. Economic development is still the #1, but you see that the sovereignty issue and cross-sovereignty issue becomes the #2 issues. So I do think that the Hong Kong incident has some kind of impact that brought the sovereignty issue more salient in these elections. Okay, one interesting part of the Tsai versus Han is that we also ask about the general public's expectation about cross-strait relations. So 43% of the general public think that if Tsai get elected, the cross-strait relations will be worse. Okay. 46% of the people think if Han elected, cross-strait relations will be better. Okay. And even the other question is about which one do you think will being elected will increase the probability for war in future years? It's also Tsai Ing-wen. But people still vote for Tsai Ing-wen, right? So what's the reason? If you think about the cross-strait relations, people will think that, well, if Han Kuo-yu got elected, it seems that the cross-strait relation could be better and the probability for war will be decreased. But still, people vote for Tsai Ing-wen. There are several other measures here. One is about Taiwan and China's relations. One of my colleagues, Su Fen, just conducted surveys just prior to the elections. He asked about the general public to define the relationship between Taiwan and China. So belong to one country, only 15% of the people think that the two areas belongs to one country, just like our constitution said. But if 76% of the people think Taiwan and China should be two countries. Okay, and 92 consensus only gain like 1/3 of the support of the general public. 43% of the people opposed using 92 consensus to reach out China. And the final thing, I think is most interesting thing is that even though people know that Tsai Ing-wen got elected, the cross-strait relations won't get any better, but they approve Tsai Ing-wen's capability to handle the cross-strait relations over the past few years. About 48% of the people approve that. And here is the data for the Hong Kong incidents. 60% of the people worry about Taiwan's future due to Hong Kong's incidents, against 34%. So Hong Kong's incident indeed influenced Taiwan's general public in terms of their attitudes toward China. And then this is nothing new. More than 80% of the people oppose the one country, two system. The final thing is kind of interesting, is that even though we saw Han Kuo-yu's flags all around in the rally, but the general public think that Tsai is more capable than Han to defend Republic of China. The question actually used Republic of China, not Taiwan. So that's kind of, I think Tsai Ing-wen is successfully used ROC Taiwan to gain the media votes, to get the kind of the people's trust about her capability to defend ROC. So my conclusion is that I think KMT misinterpreted the victory of 2018, okay, particularly Han Kuo-yu's support. And the sovereignty issue became a steady partially due to the Hong Kong's incidents. And the third thing I think most important, but voters still want to pick a more trustworthy leaders with respect to the possible China threat. And that's why I call the 2020 election is a maintaining election. And here is a final words about China's threats or opportunities, because over the past few years, there's still some debates about whether China is a big market for Taiwan. And this data is also collected before the elections, asking people about their willingness to work in China if chances are available. You see that the majority of the people actually don't want to work in China. Only about 16% of the people who are willing to work in China if opportunities comes. So China is no longer an attractive place for Taiwanese to work there, and I think that's a significant change over the decades. So here and to see if any questions, and we can continue discussion in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.